Guys, I'm going to be honest. I think the next fight for Islam is Ian Garry. Now, hear me out. Ian Garry is not the most exciting fighter at welterweight. There's probably more exciting fighters like Shavkat, who basically finishes. I think, as a matter of fact, he has finished every single opponent except for Ian Garry. So that's interesting in and of itself. It kind of builds a potential title fight for Shavkat and Ian later on if Ian can get the job done versus Islam, which I don't think is any easy feat. But let me go ahead and say that the incident that happened with Ian and Khamzat recently is definitely, I think, a foreshadowing of Ian and Islam fighting in the future, because Islam and Khamzat have a special connection with one another. They are from the same region, not the exact same region. Khamzat is from Chechnya and Islam is from Dagestan, but they are literally right next to each other and they share very similar cultures, and they're both Muslims and they come from the same region. So, with that being said, I think with this situation with Ian and Khamzat recently backstage after the recent event with everyone saw it. If you're involved in the UFC/MMA world, you of course saw what happened, right? So I think that builds a pretty sweet precursor for the Islam-Ian fight. I think it's kind of a a nudge in that direction, because you could have Khamzat basically come into the corner of Islam and you have that brotherhood there. There's sort of that correlation. And you also have the fact that Islam is brothers essentially with Khabib. Not blood brothers, but they're brothers. They grew up together and trained together, and you guys know the story. If you're an MMA fan, you know the story. So there's also that Dagestan versus Ireland element to the fight as well. Of course, the biggest fight in UFC history, Conor McGregor and Khabib, was that kind of Dagestan versus Ireland sort of thing. Granted, I don't think that was a big part of that fight. I think that fight more so was just the other drama besides that. I don't think it was necessarily an Irish versus Dagestan kind of mentality, right? Not like a nationalistic fight, if you will. But there is still that element at play. Ian's from Ireland, though he pretty much represents Brazil, from my understanding. He doesn't really represent the Irish flag as much as he does, say, Brazil. It seems like he has a stronger connection with the Brazilian fighters, right? Granted, there is a lot more of them than Irish fighters. Still, there is that element at play. So I think the fact that Islam and Khamzat come from the same region and you have that kind of build-up adds an element. And if Ian can somehow get the job done versus Islam, which, like I said, is no easy feat, it sort of builds a potential super fight between Ian and Khamzat in the future, which could be very, very interesting. If Ian were to move to middleweight, I think it adds a lot more interesting matchups for him in terms of mega fights, because if he does move to middleweight, I'm building a roadmap for Ian Garry, and that's kind of it's pretty ambitious to build, right? Because Islam is no easy feat, and I think if they were to fight, I would favor Islam in that fight for a multitude of reasons. But I don't know. Ian could get the job done. You never know. It's MMA at the end of the day. So, a roadmap for Ian Garry. He beats Islam. You have this sort of super fight built up for Khamzat in the future. If he faces Khamzat, I'm going to say that there's no way that he beats Khamzat, right? I mean, you never say never again, but right. It's Khamzat, and that matchup's would be very tough for him, I think. But if he makes that move to middleweight and he shows an honest effort, if you will, at middleweight, that builds up some other matchups for him in the future that I think could be very, very interesting. Some super fights, potentially, like Sean Strickland would be a very, very interesting fight with Ian Garry, I think. That would be it could potentially be a very boring fight in a sense, but the build-up for that fight, the press conferences, et cetera, would be very interesting. Now, of course, that is looking extremely far into the future, right? That's looking very, very far into the future. But I don't know. There's some very interesting fights in terms of build-up. I'm always thinking build-up when it comes to fights. Of course, I love the actual art of mixed martial arts. The thing that makes fights very, really big, like extremely big, is the build-up for them, right? The storyline behind it. It's no secret. You listen to Uncle Chael, right? If you listen to Uncle Chael on YouTube, you kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about, right? You have to build a character, build a story. That's what makes fights really big. Now, there are certain fights that are big just based off of competitiveness, right? You have, for example, like the recent fight, JDM, Jack Della Maddalena versus Islam. That was more so a big fight just based off of competitiveness and the fact that Islam was coming up a weight class, of course. That's always a big deal. But that fight didn't necessarily have any insane build-up in a sense of, crazy press conference moments or a crazy storyline. It was more so just a competitive Islam is coming up and JDM is, we thought at the time a tough matchup, but we also saw what happened at the end of the day there, which I do think Ian would have a better... I think he would have a better time with JDM, especially with the recent fight with Bilal. The way he came out in the fight, his stance, that low stance, and the way he uses his range, I think he would have an easier time against Islam than JDM. I do think Islam's relentlessness and his pressure, especially in a 5-round fight, we would eventually see him beat Ian, just like we saw with Shavkat. I think we would see a similar situation as Shavkat, except even better. Now, it's not to say Shavkat's not out of question to fight Islam for the title. I think with Shavkat being out so long and with Shavkat and Islam both being Muslims, I don't think it's necessarily a really big fight to make. The Muslim community in UFC and MMA, they don't. It doesn't seem that they like to fight each other. Now, I don't know if it's just if they're in the same camp they don't like to fight each other, or if it's an intrinsic thing for the Muslim community. Whatever the case, it doesn't seem like, or potentially it's even the UFC from a marketing standpoint. You don't necessarily, I don't think you would maybe want two Muslim fighters fighting each other. I don't know. I don't know if that has any sort of variable in the decision-making behind this. That's just kind of my stupid analysis of it, I guess. But I do think the main reason that Shavkat can't or shouldn't challenge for the title right now is because of his inactivity. Now, it is kind of tough saying that because he had an injury and, we don't know what it's like. I don't know what it's like personally to have an injury like that. And for all of his hard work in the past to be pushed to the side because of an injury is kind of tough to say. But maybe he should, with the competitiveness of the welterweight division, maybe he should challenge somebody else like Carlos Prates or Michael Morales for a title contention shot, and Ian and Islam will fight just based off of Ian's activity. Because it is worth rewarding activity, and the UFC likes to reward people who come in on short notice, which Ian fought Shavkat on short notice. So there's a lot of different variables in the mix when it comes to this situation. You also have Ilia Topuria. Ilia Topuria is a huge variable in this, and I think that is the fight to make, no doubt. But a lot of people are talking about Arman and Ilia fighting because Islam doesn't want to move back down to 155. He wants to stay at 170. And for Ilia to move up to 170 is kind of a tough spot for the UFC, I would be afraid. I would assume. But I don't know. The UFC is into making money, guys. So potentially Ilia and Islam is the fight to make, and it would be a massive fight. It would be an absolutely massive fight. That is the fight I would love to see at the end of the day. Islam versus Ilia is absolutely the fight I would love to see at the end of the day. But the fight that I see making the most sense, I guess, especially when you add this recent Khamzat variable and the fact that him and Islam kind of come from that same culture and same region of the world, it could add some interesting... it could add some interesting variables for Ian and Islam and that sort of fight. So, I don't know. Let me know what you guys think in the comments if you have any thoughts. And, yeah, until next time, peace.